Jesus' execution. That Jesus was condemned to death by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, subsequently tortured and crucified, and on the third day after his crucifixion was resurrected and ascended to heaven, is the foundation narrative of Christianity. His trial by the Roman authority and his death on the cross are described in all four Gospels, albeit with considerable variations. Matthew chapter 27 until 28, Mark chapter 15 until 16, Luke chapter 20 to 24, John chapter 18 until 21, and theologically interpreted by the Apostle Paul. What familiarity do the rabbis, the heroes of rabbinic Judaism, show the evangelists' interpretations of this event, or rather more carefully formulated? What do they care to tell us about it in their literature? The immediate and unambiguous answer is very little. Within the first corpus of rabbinic literature, we find but one reference to Jesus' trial and execution, and only in passing, as part of a broader halakhic discussion that nothing to do with Jesus as a historical figure. Hardly and unexpectedly, after the evidence discussed so far, this reference is present only in the Bavli. The mishnah in Tractate Sanhedrin is discussed, which deals with the procedure of the capital punishment. The Bible knows for legal modes of executing the death penalty, namely stoning, burning, and hanging. The latter is actually a post-mortem hanging of the person stoned to death, a form of publication that the capital sentence has been executed, and saying by the sword. The Talmudic law drops hanging and estranging as an independent death penalty, but the discussions in rabbinic literature are largely academic, since the rabbis did not have the power of inflicting the death sentence. With regard to stoning, the most common death penalty, the mishnah explains: if they find him the accused innocent, they discharge him, and if not, he goes forth to be stoned, and a herald goes before him heralding, so and so, the son of so and so, is going forth to be stoned because he committed such and such a crime, and so are his witnesses. However, whoever knows anything in his defense may come and state it. It is on this mishnah that the Bavli comments. Rabbi said, he, the herald, must also say, on such and such a day, on such and such an hour, and in such and such a place, the crime was committed, in case there are some who know to the contrary, so that they can come forward and prove the original witnesses to be false witnesses, having deliberately given false testimony, and a herald goes before him, etc., indeed before him, but not beforehand. However, in contradiction to this, it was taught Tanya. On Sabbath eve and the eve of Passover, Jesus the Nazarene was hanged, Telauhu, and a herald went forth before him 40 days, heralding Jesus the Nazarene is going forth to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, killed, and instigated his seed, and seduced Hydia, his girl, to idolatry. Whoever knows anything in his defense may come and state it. But since they did not find anything in his defense, they hang him on Sabbath eve and the eve of Sabbath eve and the eve of Passover. Ulla said, do you suppose that Jesus the Nazarene was one of whom a defense could be made? He was a message someone was instigated Israel to idolatry, concerning whom the merciful says, show him no compassion and do not shield him. Deuteronomy chapter 13 verse 9. With Jesus the Nazarene it was different, for he was close to the government Malchut. This is a remarkable Bavli sugya. It starts with a comment by Abaye, a Babylonian Amora of the early 4th century, arguing that mishnahs fudge such and such a crime must be made more precise. The herald should not just mention the crime, but add to the day, hour, and location of the crime. Only this more detailed description of the crime circumstances guarantees the validity of the testimony of new witnesses who contradict the testimony of the original witnesses, which had led to the defendant's condemnation. The clear purpose of Abaya's statement is to facilitate the acquittal of the accused. The Bavli then returns to the mishnah lemma that regulates the procedure undertaken by the herald. The anonymous Bavli also clarifies the unambiguous lurking before him the convicted and specifies physically before the convicted on his way to the execution and not chronologically some other time before the day of the execution. This specification, which clearly conforms to the plain meaning of the mishnah, mixed with a contradicting teaching which proves itself to be an early Baraita introduced by the promulgatanya. The precedent was set. It argues of Jesus the Nazarene, in whose case the herald did not go out just before the execution, but rather 40 days beforehand, meaning either 40 consecutive days before the day of his execution, or just the 40th day before the execution was carried out. Whatever the precise meaning of these 40 days is, most likely the latter, it becomes clear that this Baraita contradicts the mishnah as it is understood by the anonymous author of the Bavli, allowing for a considerable interval between the announcement of the herald and the actual execution. Distinction between the mishnah Bavli and the Baraita is solved by an exchange between Ula, also a Babylonian Amora of the early 4th century, and his anonymous respondents. Since Jesus had friends in high places, the Jews took extra precautions before executing him. They went beyond the letter of the law, so none of his powerful friends could accuse them of executing an innocent man. Accordingly, the exchange seems to conclude his case was not an halakhically valid precedent, but rather a real exception. In other words, the Baraita does not contradict the mishnah. It is written with this halakhic discourse that some details of Jesus' condemnation and execution are reported. He was hanged on the eve of Passover, which, according to one manuscript, happened to be Sabbath Eve. The herald made the announcement required by the law 40 days before the execution took place. Jesus was executed because he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel into idolatry. Nobody came to his defense. He was close to the government. Several of these details can be easily explained against the background of the relevant mishnah in Tractate Sanhedrin. There, the standard procedure according to the rabbinic law is explained as follows. All who were stoned are also hanged neatly afterwards on a tree. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. However, the sages said, only the blasphemer Ha-Megadev and the idolater Ha-Ovet Avodasara are hanged. To a man, they hang him facing the as to a man, he hang him facing the people, and as to a woman, they hang her facing the tree. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. However, the sages said, the man is hanged, but the woman is hanged at all. How do they hang him? They drive a post into the background, and a beam juts from it, and one ties together his two hands upon the other, and thus one hang him. Rabbi Yosef says, the post leans against a wall, and one hangs him the way but checks to it, and they untie him immediately. Because if he stays on the tree overnight, one transgresses a negative commandment on his account, as it is said, you must not leave his corpse on the tree overnight, but you must bury him the same day. For he who is hanged talui is a curse against God, Elohim, etc. Deuteronomy chapter 21 verse 23. That is to say, On what account has this man been hanged? Because he cursed the name, and the name of heaven turned out to be profane. The mishnah systematically and it is what beautifully started away, sets out to clarify the procedure of hanging, who is hanged, how is he, she hanged, and for how long. The question of who is answered differently by Rabbi Eliezer and the sages, whereas Rabbi Eliezer as a rule, as everybody hanged who has been stoned to death. The sages limit his procedure to the capital crimes of blasphemy and idolatry. Both Rabbi Eliezer and the sages, however, presuppose that hanging is a post-mortem punishment after the convicted criminal has been stoned to death. Following the biblical instruction, which, after relating the stoning of the rebellious son, continues, if someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed, namely by stoning, and you hang him on the tree. Deuteronomy chapter 21 verse 22. Continuing with verse 23, you must not leave his corpse on the tree. In a similar broader definition, Rabbi Eliezer extends the hanging after stoning equally on men and women, distinguishing between the sexes only with regard to whether or not they first the court witnessing the execution, whereas it says exclude women from hanging altogether. As to the how mishnah divides the tree, and the way the convicted criminal is hanged on it. The biblical tree is ambiguous and can mean a pole, e.g. Genesis chapter 40 verse 19, or gallows, or even impalement upon a stake, e.g. Esther chapter 9 verse 13. The mishnah gives the explanations of the tree. The first anonymous description comes closest to gallows, a post driven into the ground and beam jutting from it, presumably close to the top, whereas Rabbi Yosef has a post in mind, the lower end of which rests on the earth and the upper end leans against a wall. Accordingly, in the first case the criminal is hanged on the beam, and in the second case she hangs on the post like buttocks to the slaughtered animals, presumably hanging upside down with the feet attached to the top of the post. The third question, how long, is answered unequivocally and with reference to the biblical command. The public exposure of the corpse of the executed criminal must be terminated by the end of the day of the execution, because he or she must be buried the same day. The corpse must not stay on the tree overnight. And then, in an interpretation of the second part of the biblical verse, the mishnah returns to the question of who is hanged and why. The phrase Kilelat Elohim is again ambiguous, and here interpreted as a curse against God, in the sense that the criminal has attacked a curse against God by cursing God's name. In other words, he is the blaspheming Megadeth, who, according to sages and of course also to Rabbi Eliezer, deserves to be hanged. Against this background, it is clear for the authors of our Bavli narrative that Jesus was first stoned and then hanged. This is fully concurrent with the mishnah halakha. The same is true of the reason for his stoning and hanging. He was a sorcerer and enticed Israel into idolatry. But both crimes are explained in full detail in Mishnah Sanhedrin, whereas the above quoted Mishnah mentions only the blasphemer and the idolater. Later on, the Mishnah gives a much longer list of crimes that deserve the capital punishment, among them the Misit Madia and the Mechasef, sorcery, precisely as listed in our Bavli narrative. The Mech is someone who seduces an individual idolatry, whereas the Madia is understood as someone who publicly entices many into idolatry. Jesus, the Talmud tells us, was both. He not only enticed some individual, but all of Israel to become idolaters. To make things worse, he was also a sorcerer in the sense defined more precise in the mishnah, someone who really practiced magic and not just hurts people's eyes. Ha'ohes et ha'enayim, that is, who deludes people by optical deception who is permitted. Finally, the herald publicly proclaims his crime and asks for defense witnesses, follows the mishnah rule, except for the fact, as we have seen, that the herald does so 40 days before the execution takes place. What is not explicitly mentioned in the Bavli, however, is the provision in the Bible as well as in the mishnah that the corpse of the executed must not be exposed overnight. Let us now compare the Bavli narrative with the testimony of the Gospels. First, the charge. The Bavli mentions sorcery and idolatry, seduction of all of Israel into idolatry, but since the idolater is covered with the blasphemy in the mishnah, the charge of blasphemy may well be presupposed in the Bavli too. The evangelist's depictions of the charge against Jesus are twofold. According to the trial brought before the council of the high priest, the scribes, and the elders, the Sanhedrin, and before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, he pretended to be Messiah, but the Jews interpret this claim as his declaration to be the Son of God, and hence as blasphemy, whereas Pilate concludes from it that Jesus wants to be the King of the Jews of Israel, and hence is to be regarded as political troublemaker. The New Testament does not explicitly mention the charge of sorcery, but the first charge brought against Jesus by the false witnesses is the alleged claim that he is able to destroy the temple and to rebuild it in 3 days. This claim could easily be understood by the Talmud editors as sorcery. Moreover, Jesus' practice of casting out demons is explicitly connected with the messianic claim and may indeed be presupposed in the trial before the high court. Interestingly enough, when Celsus portrays Jesus as returning with certain magical powers from Egypt, he concludes that because of these powers and on account of them, he gave himself the title of God, clearly connecting sorcery with the claim to be God. It is futile, therefore, to contrast to narrowly the charge of blasphemy, New Testament, with the charge of idolatry, sorcery, Bavli. The narratives in both the New Testament and the Bavli are much more complex and thicker than so minimalist an approach is able to reveal. Again, it is not it's alleged Talmudic source for the trial of Jesus that is at stake here and needs to be refuted by the Talmudic reading and interpretation of the New Testament narrative. As far as the charge of his concern, both are closer than one might expect at first glance. As to the procedure of the execution, the Gospel narrative clearly agrees with the mishnah procedure according to which the witnesses, particularly in criminal cases, but Matthew and Mark inform us that the Sanhedrin needed witnesses to proceed with the trial, but that the legal procedure was advanced from the outset, and hence in disagreement with the mishnah, insofar as the Sanhedrin was deliberately looking for false witnesses. Finally, the members of the Sanhedrin did find two accurate witnesses, as required by the law, who put forward the accusation of the destruction and rebuilding within 3 days of temple. Since Jesus did not respond to this obviously fabricated accusation, the high priest came up with the most devastating charge of the alleged blasphemy. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, Son of God, which Jesus answered affirmatively Mark, or at least ambiguously Matthew. In view of this evident mistrial, it is a matter of course that the Gospel narrative leaves out the procedure of the herald seeking additional witnesses who might invalidate the testimony of the original witnesses that led to the conviction. the high priest only, though the high priest only to happy with Jesus' acceptance of the charge of blasphemy, has the Sanhedrin condemned him to death, and with no other though hand him over to the Roman governor to confirm and to execute the sentence, a procedure such as prescribed in the mishnah, for the herald may only have disturbed this charge this carefully orchestrated trial. But why does the Talmud insist on the strange detail of the herald announcing the execution 40 days before it takes place? The plain answer it gives is to give enough time to persuade witnesses in Jesus' defense to come forward and to argue against the accusation. But there might be another subtext here that against subtly, or rather not so subtly, responds to the New Testament narrative. There, Jesus tells his disciples 3 times that he will be killed and resurrected within 3 days, the last time on his way to Jerusalem before the Passion begins, that is only before Passover. They were on the road going to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the high priest and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." In emphasizing that the herald announced Jesus' execution, and not just immediately before it took place, but precisely 40 days in advance, the Bavli directly contradicts Jesus' own prediction. Why all this push about him playing the product by dramatically prophesying his trial, sentence, and death? Not only once, but 3 times. The last time even a few days before it was about to happen. We all know the Talmud context, that he was going to be executed before the Jewish court has made this decision in public proceedings, as is customary in the Jewish law, and moreover had sent out a herald to proclaim the sentence publicly 40 days before the execution, unusually long period not required in the mishnah, so that everybody could know it and, if necessary, had ample time to come up with exonerating evidence to prevent a wrong judgment. Hence, in providing the 40-day period, the Bible intends to expose Jesus once more as a swindler and false prophet who makes a fool of himself in claiming to predict what everybody already knew. Now, the death penalty and execution. Here, we have a major discrepancy between the New Testament and the Talmud. According to the New Testament, Jesus was crucified obviously following Roman law, whereas according to the Talmud, he was stoned and subsequently hanged following rabbinic law. The reason for this, of course, was the simple fact that the Sanhedrin could not impose and execute the death penalty, but had to rely on the Roman authority, which followed Roman and not rabbinic law. So shall we conclude from this that the rabbinic does not preserve any reliable evidence about the historical trial and execution of Jesus, and instead imposes on him later rabbinic law? Yes, of course, but again, this is the wrong question. Not the historical execution. Crucifixion versus stoning, hanging is at stake here, but the question of why the Talmud regards it as a matter of course, or rather insists that Jesus was executed according to rabbinic law. To answer this question, the rabbis were certainly aware that crucifixion was a standard Roman death penalty, that Jesus was indeed crucified and not stoned and hanged. Hence, why the stubborn insistence on the latter? Because this is precisely the core of the polemical counter-narrative to the Gospels. The author of our Bavli Baraita does not need to discuss the New Testament report as such. The fact that Jesus was put on trial and executed like an ordinary criminal was devastating enough. Such a story can hardly be made any worse. Instead of the two and indeed conflicting stories about Jesus' trial in the New Testament, he chooses the Jewish one and completely ignores the Roman one. Unlike Pilate, who emphasized the political part of the charge against Jesus, our Bavli also adopts and interprets the fiction of the trial before the Sanhedrin, combining it with the mishnah law, the accusation and condemnation of a blasphemer and idolater, who led astray all of Israel. We the Jews, he argues, have put him on trial and executed him for what he was, a blasphemer who came to God and deserved the capital punishment according to our Jewish law. With this deliberate misreading of the New Testament narrative, the Bible reclaims Jesus for the Jewish people, but only to fend off once and for all any claim by himself or his followers. Yes, indeed, the Bible admits Jesus was a Jewish heretic who was quite successful in seducing many of us, but he was taken care of according to the Jewish law, got what he deserved, and that's the end of the story. The Baraita in our Bavli narrative about Jesus' execution adds yet another remarkable detail that needs closer inspection. All the uncensored manuscripts and printed editions of the Bavli reveal the precise day of his execution. He was hung on the eve of Passover, that is, the day before Passover. The same is true for the only rabbinic parallel to our story, also in the Bavli, where it is said that the son of Dada was hanged in Lod Lida on the eve of Passover. This conspicuously precise date is concordant with John, whose gospel contradicts the three synoptic gospels, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke are quite far about the date of the trial and execution, but clearly state that Jesus eats the Passover meal, the Last Supper, with his disciples before he is arrested. Matthew chapter 26 verse 3f. Even states explicitly that the high priest and the elders of the people postponed Jesus' arrest until the Passover in order to avoid a riot among the people, and was crucified on the first day of the feast, the 15th day, on the month of Nisan. John declares that the Last Supper is not the Passover meal, but takes place before Passover. Instead, the trial before Pilate takes place about noon on the very day on which in the evening Passover begins, the 14th of Nisan. Hence, whereas the synoptic gospels agree that Jesus was executed on the 15th of Nisan, the first day of Passover, it is only John who says that the execution took place on the 14th of Nisan, the day before Passover. Interestingly enough, it is the particular holiness of Passover falling on a Sabbath that John gives us the reason for the Jewish request to have Jesus and the two other criminals buried on that very Friday. The Jews did not want the bodies of the executed left on the cross over Sabbath. This seems to be slightly distorted reference to the biblical and rabbinic law that the body of an executed criminal must remain on the tree cross overnight, any night, just not just the Sabbath night. Finally, the Bavli has preserved a further conspicuous detail that betrays an intimate knowledge of the New Testament passion narrative, that Jesus was close to the government, and therefore the herald went out 40 days before the execution to ask for other witnesses. This detail does not belong to the Baraita, but is not the answer to Ullah's later objection. In all four Gospels, Pilate, the Roman governor, tries to save Jesus and to have Barabbas crucified instead of him. Thus, one can indeed get the impression that Jesus had no less powerful a protector than the governor himself. Pilate explicitly makes a great effort to convince the Jews that he hasn't found any case against him and wants to release him, but the Jews won't give in. It is again the Gospel of John that is particularly specific in this regard. There, when Pilate tries to release Jesus, the Jews cry out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor." Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. So the Jews play the Roman governor off against his master, the emperor, and that was the last thing in the world that Pilate needed, to be accused of disloyalty to the emperor. Jesus does not gain time, as the Talmud has it, but is immediately sentenced and executed. The very fact that the Talmud's claim of Jesus' closeness to the Roman government reflects some knowledge, certainly not of the historical course of events, but of the New Testament narrative, particularly of John's version of it, does not come as a surprise anymore. What is more amazing is that this detail exonerates the Roman government from the blame of Jesus' condemnation, and consequently, adopting the Gospel's message puts the thrust of the accusation on the Jews. I have no definite answer to this rather odd conclusion, but it may well have to do with the fact that this element of our story is not part of the early Palestinian Baraita, but of the 14th century CE Babylonian discourse upon it. Could it be that the Babylonian Jews had a more relaxed attitude toward the Roman government in Palestinian than their Palestinian Britain, who suffered increasingly from the Christian variety of Roman government? But the Jews in Babylonia must have known pretty well what was going on in Palestine in the early 4th century. Ullah, although a Babylonian Amora, had moved from Palestine to Babylonia and frequently traveled back and forth between Babylonia and Palestine. Moreover, it is one thing to follow the New Testament fiction that Pilate tried very hard to rescue Jesus. But it is quite another to accept the message that, therefore, the Jews are to be blamed for his death. On the other hand, we should not forget that it was also the gist of the Baraita narrative that the Jews took upon themselves the responsibility for Jesus' execution. For the later Babylonian discourse may not want to accept the Gospel's blame for Jesus' death. Rather, like the Baraita, but with different reasoning, it may want to convey the message, yes, the Roman governor wanted to set him free, but we did not give in. He was a blasphemer and idolater, and although the Romans probably could not care less, we insisted that he get what he deserved. We even convinced the Roman governor, or more precisely, forced him to accept that this heretic and impostor needed to be executed, and we are proud of it. What we then have here in the Bavli is a powerful confirmation of the New Testament passion narrative, a creative rereading, a work that not only knows some of its distinct leaders, but boldly proclaims Jewish responsibility for Jesus' execution. Ultimately, and more precisely, therefore, it turns out to be a comprehension of the New Testament's message of shame and guilt with WhatsApp. It argues responsibility for this heretic's death, but there is no reason to be ashamed of it and feel guilty for it. We are not the murderers of the Messiah and Son of God, nor of the King of the Jews as Pilate wanted to have it. Rather, we are the rightful executioners of a blasphemer and idolater who was sentenced according to the full weight but also the fair procedure of our law. If this interpretation is correct, we are confronted here with a message that boldly and even aggressively challenges the Christian charges against the Jews and the killers of Christ. For the first time in history, he encountered Jews who, instead of reacting defensively, raise their voice and speak out against what would become the perennial story of the triumphant church.